presentation today on Better Reserve Studies. I have Nick Brenneman here with me. He is with K7 Design. He will be the presenter today. My name is Brenda Gruchowski. I'm the Director of Business Development for Vesta Property Services. I'll be monitoring the Q&A and trying to respond to those questions that you have. And the presentation is about an hour long. And Nick said he would stay for a handful of questions after his presentation, but we appreciate you being here. We appreciate those here in person with us today. So we'll kick it off to Nick. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I appreciate it. It looks like we've got online about 150 people. We've got a room full of folks here. And so we've got some great information to share. We were just talking about how budget season is upon us again. And I feel like we just went through this, but this is definitely going to be a relevant course, a relevant topic for what's coming up. And hopefully you leave here with some good information that, helps guide your communities and makes this budget season a little bit easier. And you feel a little bit more informed, a little bit more equipped to serve your residents. One housekeeping note, if you're a CAM on the call, this course will satisfy a 1 hour of your continuing education credit. It's an IFM credit. I know it's a renewal year. Make sure you get that credit. When you signed up, there was a spot to put your CAM number and check if you're a CAM or not. But if for some reason you're in here and you don't know if you submitted that, go ahead and throw it in the Q&A or throw it in the chat, or even send, Brenda an email. Any way you want to get that information to us, we'll make sure that you get your credit submitted. And if you are a CAM on the call and you'd like a certificate of completion, which is typical for the DBPR courses, I'm happy to email you one as well. So just reach out to me. I'll get that for you. All right, I'm going to just share the presentation and we'll get going here. We will monitor the Q&A throughout, so feel free to put your questions in there. And I'm working on one screen here, so let's see if I can do this. In. There we go. All right. So how many of you have looked at a reserve study and thought, okay, now you're not alone. So after 15 years, the biggest challenge isn't getting the reserve study, but it's really knowing how to use it. And before we talk about reports, let's zoom out. Nobody drives by a skyscraper and admires the concrete underground. But ask any engineer, and they'll tell you that that's the most important part of that building. Communities are exactly the same. You see, the residents see the landscaping, the perfect paved roads, the amenities, but they never see the planning that keeps it all standing. So what exactly is that foundation? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. And it really is based on having a healthy reserve, a plan for your reserves and your major capital projects that really supports every future decision and investment. So it's a little bit about me, just so you know who's talking to you. I've spent the last 15 years helping boards answer one question. Are we going to be okay? And, making sure that they have a path forward for a sustainable future to fulfill their fiduciary duty, to serve their community. And there's just a little bit more information about me there. So we'll look at reserve funds, the big picture. Like I said, we've got to zoom out first, but then we're going to look at the reserve study process, the importance of reserves, the reserve study process. What is a reserve study? Then take a look at the cost of inaction, the importance of reserves, which go hand in hand, keeping your reserve study current, pro tips for better planning, and then some close. Most people think that reserve studies affect only a handful of communities, but the truth is they affect almost everyone. CAI's Foundation for Research published these numbers, and it's quite staggering, but reserve funds managed by U.S. community associations exceeds $120 billion with a B, and 365,000 associations serve 75 million residents nationwide. which amounts to $10 trillion in real estate assets under their stewardship. That's an incredible amount of responsibility. Unfortunately, not every association is embracing that and handling that with the care that it needs to be handled with. And the statistics prove that, because the same Foundation for Research published that under 35% of associations are well funded by reserve adequacy standards. 1 in 4 associations have never had a professional reserve study. And half of the reserve studies are over 5 years old, risking outdated budgets. So why does this matter? Cost and consequences. We've seen a 40% or higher rise in construction and material costs since 2020. I know you guys are seeing that. It's across the board. The average special assessment per unit is now over $7,500, and cost increases for roofs, elevators, and waterproofing are up to 80%. So imagine budgeting to replace a roof back in 2019, putting that number in a reserve study, and going to get bids today. That's a situation that boards are living in right now. So why do reserve studies matter? Well, reserve studies give you protection because well-planned reserves protect against costly, unexpected special assessments. Reserve studies give the community stability because this reserve study is the financial roadmap, and accountability because without it, communities do face serious financial risk, and it trickles down to the resident dissatisfaction. So this raises a pretty obvious question. What is a reserve study? Not going to go too in depth because I know that in a group this size, many of you have done reserve studies. You know what a reserve study is, but we will keep this high level, and it'll be a good maybe refresher if you've done them before, or if you're a beginner, this will be some really great information too. So if I asked 10 different board members to give me the definition of a reserve study, I would probably get 10 different answers. And that's the truth. But this is my favorite. A reserve study is a long-term financial planning tool for community associations. It identifies major common area components, estimates for their remaining useful life, and projects future repair and replacement costs. Also, associations can plan, budget, and avoid financial surprises. The way CAI puts it is a reserve study is a budget planning tool that identifies the components of a community association, the ones that are responsible for maintaining or replacing, the status of the reserve fund, and a stable and equitable funding plan to offset anticipated future major common area expenditures. Stable and equitable are great words when we're talking about reserve studies, because what's not stable and equitable is a $7,500 special assessment. Equitable means everybody's paying their fair share. So they're paying their ongoing portion of the depreciation as time goes on. Stable means that it's predictable. So we don't wait 15 years and then pay it all at once, but we're making incremental contributions to our reserves so that we have the adequate funds. Stable, equitable, adequate. That's kind of the magic 3 when it comes to reserves. Protects property values, supports financial stability, prevents unexpected special assessments, and ensures legal and fiduciary compliance. Notice something in here. It never says it's just a report. And I think sometimes people think like, oh, a reserve study is just a report. They don't call it a report, not even CAI. It's a budget planning tool. So if it's a tool, we need to know how to use it. And that's why this information is so important. This is foundational information to being good stewards of our association. So how do we build one? Well, the reserve study really consists of 2 major parts, the physical analysis and the financial analysis. And if you break it down even further, each of those have 2 parts. So we have the physical evaluation, which consists of the meeting and the inspection. And then we have the financial analysis, which looks at the fund status and then establishes the funding plan. So think of this like going to the doctor, okay? The meeting, that's like going over your medical history, making sure that the doctor knows everything that's been going on with you. The inspection, that's like your physical exam. That's where we've got eyes on the property, actually looking at it. The financial analysis, the fund status, that's like your diagnosis. The doctor's kind of telling you, all right, this is what you got going on. And your funding plan is the treatment plan. How are we going to fix it? Or how are we going to get you where you need to be? So we'll break these down a little bit. The meeting, this is usually where we uncover surprises. For example, oh, we thought the HOA maintained this, but it turns out that that's maintained by the county. Or, you know, we thought that the townhome owners were responsible for their own roofs, but it turns out the HOA maintains those and would have to fund replacing those. So the meeting is where we go through the scope of responsibility, understand what's the association's responsibility. We look at the history of capital projects and we review the budget. We review the budget for a number of reasons, a couple of them. So one is we want to kind of get a holistic view of the association's finances to make sure that for the things in a reserve study that aren't one size fits all, that we're making the right judgment call as far as, you know, what number or what value to assign to your community. So one example of that is like something that we have in the reserve study world is like an operating threshold, which means that when you're looking at a reserve study and you see all the components in the spreadsheet that are contributing to the funding plan, there's going to be other components that the association owns and maintains that aren't on that list. Why are they excluded? Who determines which ones are excluded and which ones aren't? A lot of that comes down to this threshold cost, where we say, well, we're a community of this size with this big of a budget, so anything above X dollars, we want that in our reserves. But anything below it, we don't want it in our reserves, because the goal is not to have every single component, because then it's going to get so big and cumbersome that it's not going to be a useful budget planning tool, which is what it's intended to be. So that's where we're looking at the budget. Another reason it says here, avoid shortfalls and double funding. That has, again, to do with this operating versus reserves conversation. We don't want to assume that the association is planning on funding something out of operating, but they're actually intending to use reserves to fund that and leaving it out of the study, or vice versa, double funding. If you say, oh, we're going to do our pool furniture and pay for it out of our operating budget, but we have pool furniture in your reserve schedule, then you're double funding that. So we do look at the budget closely. Those are just a couple of things that we're looking at. So after the meeting, once we get our ducks in a row, it's also a great opportunity for the board to ask questions of the engineer. You know, help us understand this, or we've been dealing with that. If there's a particular component at the community that's like a hot button in the community or has been, you know, particularly troublesome, that's a great time to point that out. So make sure that we spend, you know, extra time on it and pay extra careful attention. And so we can answer questions as well, and we'll have questions for the association too. So the meeting is really kind of like a great meeting of the minds to get all our ducks in a row. And then we put our boots on the ground and we conduct the on-site inspection, which is the physical exam, the physical analysis. Basically, we're looking at classifying the property. What are your reserve components? A reserve component has to be above that threshold that we're going to set for the replacement cost, but it also has to be owned and maintained by the association. So there's other items, maybe your mailboxes are, the postal service maintains those. Well, we don't want to include those in the reserve study. So as we're walking around your property, we're classifying the property and kind of saying what category are these components in, and getting the list of the true reserve components. For the reserve components, then we're measuring them, we're quantifying them, taking an inventory, counting light poles. We've got our, usually you'll see us with our cool wheeling the pavement, getting square footages. And then we look at the condition and the life expectancy. And life expectancy has to do with not only the age of the component, but also the condition. So, you know, if something's been lovingly maintained, even though maybe a little bit older, it'll extend that useful life compared to something that maybe it's a newer component, but it's been completely neglected. That's going to have a shorter remaining useful life. So that's a really important distinction that when you're looking at useful lives in a reserve study, it is much more than just, oh, well, this is when it was installed or this is when it was built. We've got to piece together the full picture. How is this thing maintained? And what sort of impact is that going to have on the remaining useful life? Another impact on useful life is like the use of the component. Is this in an area that's getting heavy use? For example, if we've got a big, master plan community with private roads, there's main roads where, major thoroughfares, but then kind of the offshoots where there's just a cul-de-sac or a few homes, those roads aren't getting nearly as much traffic. And so we wouldn't want to just assume that they're all wearing the same, that they all need to be on the same replacement schedule. So that's kind of the manner of replacement here that we're talking about. And we look at factors that would affect the cost, and then we can help prioritize projects as well. Now that we're seeing everything at once, we can say, you know what, this is our top priority, and that can probably wait, because now we have this 30,000 foot view where we can look at everything at a glance. That 30,000 foot view, that's a really valuable resource for boards to have. It's much better than waiting for an email, driving by and noticing something. The 30,000 foot view is like, all right, we see where all the pieces are going to fit. We know what is top priority. We know what can wait. We can also coordinate things now. So if we're going to do this project and block off this road or, do the roofs and the gutters are going to be the next year, well, we might as well do the roofs and the gutters the same year. So you can start to not only prioritize what needs to be done first, but you can start to coordinate projects as well. And this is all from the reserve study. So once we finish the inspection, then comes the part that really everyone thinks the reserve study is, the financial analysis. And a lot of times this surprises people, but this is probably the easiest part of the whole study. Because if you do the beginning right, it's all just inputs and outputs. And so if you have the right inputs, you're going to get the right output. If you put the right address in your Waze or your Google Maps, it's going to take you to the right place. And so that's really what it comes down to here is if we spend a lot of time doing all of the pre-work, if we have the right components and we have the right useful lives and we have the right costs and we lay them out in a 30-year schedule and we look at the total expenditures each year. So, some years we're going to have a lot of projects. Some years we might have one or two. Some years we might not have any. But then we total all of those expenses up. Then we come up with a plan to offset those expenses by adding cash to the reserve account in stable, equitable, incremental contributions. So we're just balancing the cash in and the cash out. And it's really this cash flow of saving our reserves and spending our reserves and saving our reserves and spending our reserves. And that's a beautiful plan to follow. The goal of reserve funding is not to just hold all this money in reserves. You're not going to get rich investing your reserves. You barely make any return on them. The goal is to be strategic and to optimize the money that you're collecting so that it can serve your association to its highest potential. So the financial analysis, we look at the starting point. That's your fund balance. Where are you at right now? What do you have in reserves? Then we look at your contributions. What do you have budgeted that you're going to contribute to reserves this year? And like I said, then we look at the total expenditures each year. And then our final output is the funding recommendation, the future contribution levels. So we're not going to get into this, but there's different funding methodologies. There's different approaches to how we determine how much is enough, how much is adequate. But that's also a very interesting conversation. But regardless of what funding methodology you choose, if you have the right inputs, then you're going to have a clear path moving forward. But not every reserve study is built the same. Oh, I thought I had water. It's back here. So. In fact, the National Reserve Study standards identify 4 levels of service. This, I think, is a really good thing to know because they don't do a very good job with the titles. The people think reserve study, and it just sounds like it's one thing. It's a reserve study. But when you look at the nuance, it means something very different about the scope of service, the level of service, depending on which one you're signing up for. Different providers offer different ones at different times. This is an important conversation. Also, the prices are very different as well. So level 1 is what they call a full reserve study. Level 1 full reserve study. That's a complete component inventory, condition assessment, life valuation estimates, and the funding plan with a site visit every time. Level 1 is like starting from scratch. Okay, so if we're continuing the medical analogy, that's going to be like complete physical, everything, looking at everything for the first time. Then they have what's called, once you've done your level 1, then you can move into update territory. Now you don't have to do level 1s. You've got your level 1. You have your component inventory established. Now we can take that component inventory and just kind of recalibrate it for how the costs have changed, what's been occurring at the community, how you've been contributing to your reserves. There's financial pieces, there's useful lives that we want to look at again and maybe adjust, but we still know you have 58 light poles. That hasn't changed. So we get into update territory where the component inventory then is just verified. So we'll spot check some measurements, recount some things. But if we have confidence in that and it's recent enough, then it kind of streamlines the process. And that's why updates are typically less expensive than a full level 1 reserve study. And there's 2 different levels of updates. So if you have a full study, you can do a level 2 update, which is with a site visit, or you can do a level 3 update, which is without a site visit. The only difference really is the site visit. The output really looks the same. What is the benefit of adding a site visit? The site visit allows us to re-inspect the components. You get another physical exam. So we really dial in those remaining useful lives. In Florida, that can be really valuable because of, this environment is really hard on components. If you're near the ocean, the salt air, hurricanes, if you replace things with insurance claims, there's a lot of things changing and, a lot of stress on our physical properties here in Florida and really everywhere. And so the physical exam, again, is going to help us dial in those remaining useful lives. Hey, was that component aging as we had predicted? Oh, no, it really took a beating and it needs to be, we need to move that replacement up. That's what that's the benefit of doing the site visit. An update without a site visit is really like, there's different names you might hear. So you might hear like desktop update, financial update, because we're not putting our boots on the ground. We're not going back to the property. We're just like, it's a telephone call. It's a Zoom meeting with the board. Hey, this is what we've done. This is what we want to change. This is where we're at. Now kind of rejigger everything and output a new funding plan. And then the 4th level is level 4, which we're seeing more and more of this because builders and developers want to get reserves right from the very beginning. But a level 4 is a reserve study from plans. So before it's even built, we're doing reserve studies from plans. And we take the measurements and the quantities off of the architectural plans and the drawings. And then we basically establish like a very early on reserve plan and reserve budget so they can have a starting point as they're building, as they're developing. And of course, over time, once things are built, then we do the site inspection, dial things in, but that's a useful tool as well. So medical analogy, this is like your full, level 1 is like your full physical. Level 2, the update with site visit, that's like your annual checkup. You're still seeing the doctor, but we're just kind of checking in. You need some refills on that medication. How are things looking? Level 3, that's like telehealth. I loved that, right? Like we're still seeing the doctor and getting the information, but we're never actually going there. And then level 4, and I came up with this. Let me know what you think. Preliminary, right? It's not built yet. It's like prenatal. Like that's prenatal medicine. Is that good? No, that's cringe. I couldn't think of anything else that would be like the baby wasn't born yet. It's still in the belly. So what happens when communities don't do this? The cost of inaction. Good reserve planning isn't a luxury. It's really a responsibility. Property values can decline. Reason being is when major repairs are delayed, deterioration starts to become visible. So having healthy reserves and having a plan allows you to not wait until the last minute, not put a Band-Aid on things that are falling down. You don't have to lose the curb appeal. You don't have to pick and choose what we're going to fix and what we're going to just leave looking kind of nasty and run down. But we can keep everything tight and keep up the curb appeal until the property values are maintained because it's just a nicer place to live and it has greater marketability. Special assessments spike. Emergency assessments can exceed $100,000 per unit. If we're talking about, an older association that's, neglected reserves since the very beginning, they've waived reserves, they've waived reserves, they've waived reserves. Now you got a 50, 60-year-old tower that's falling apart, and every balcony is failing, and it needs a full concrete restoration, and there's only 42 unit owners, and they're on fixed incomes. That's a very bad situation to be in. But as I'm describing that, it's like I've talked to so many people that's the world that they're living in. So I think, one thing is like the fact that the preliminary studies before things are even built is becoming a thing shows the importance of having a plan early. Because that 50-year-old community, I bet they wish they could go back in time and raise the assessments an extra $5 for 50 years and have the building safe in the community that they want to live in. Financing gets harder. Insurance and loan approvals may be denied without a current plan. Boy, let me tell you, I don't have time to cover everything, but yesterday I taught a class with Jody Horn from Fannie Mae. And so I heard it straight from the source of truth about the changes that are coming to their lending guidelines. This isn't a statute, this isn't a law, but this is going to have a very real effect on the ability to buy and sell units in our condos, the ability to refinance units in our condos. And not only that, but Fannie Mae kind of sets these standards, and all the other lenders look to them as the example. So this is going to be a very real thing that if you're not meeting their benchmarks, meeting their requirements, it's not going to be a good thing for the association. So financing absolutely gets harder, and it's getting harder if you don't have healthy reserves. And emergency repairs cost more. So when we do things, the longer we wait to fix something, the more expensive it gets. Like we all know that. We've seen examples of that in our life. Like that little cavity, you would have just gone and got a filling, but you waited and waited and waited. Now you need a crown, and you need to get on a financing plan because it's so expensive. Buildings are the same. Our communities are the same. If you would have just done that waterproofing, then you wouldn't need to do all of that mold and all this, like ripping everything up, because you just didn't do it early on. So, and emergencies cost more too. When you need to do things now, you don't have the luxury of time. And time really is a luxury, and it's something that we can use to our advantage. Boards also face personal liability. So you guys know that directors risk exposure for financial mismanagement. So, what better way to get that weight off your shoulders than to say, no, this isn't just my opinion. I'm following the advice of a professional, an independent third party. And community trust erodes. Maybe a better way to look at that is like you can build community trust by doing it right, like by taking action. Because it really does. The healthy communities that have, great conversations, that are asking the hard questions and working through these things and putting a plan in place, they're united. I mean, you sit through those board meetings and it's very different than the ones who just, have their head in the sand and aren't very transparent. And I know like people are people, and this all sounds great in theory, but you guys are like, Nick, you don't know Mary on my board, or you don't know this owner and what he says at that meeting. But we're on the board, if we're serving associations, CAMs too, we're there to make something happen. We got to take action, and sometimes it takes hard decisions and hard conversations. So build community trust with healthy reserves. You can be very open about it. Look, guys, this is our reserve study. These are the numbers. I'm not increasing my assessments because I want to go run off and buy a Cadillac like that Seinfeld episode. This is what it's really going to take to keep this community the way that we need it to be. I asked Jody yesterday at Fannie Mae, when you have this conversation with your residents about having to raise the assessments, what's a good way to say it? And she had a really insightful response. She said, I would ask them, what type of community do we want to be? At our very core, who are we? When we bought into this community and as leaders and stewards of this community, what are we building here? Because if we're serious about building something that's great, then it's going to take, difficult decisions, and it's going to take planning and thought. So I went a little off on a tangent there, but trust is very important with your communities. And it's like everything else gets easier when you have trust, and you can build that by having a reserve plan in place, being transparent about where things are at. So you can see like reserves aren't really only about money. I would think about it more as like peace of mind, predictability, confidence, trust. So reserves protect the community's investment, avoid special assessments and loans, reduce long-term maintenance costs, preserve the appearance of the community. This slide could probably go, right? We already covered all this. Keeps the community safe and viable. So if you're in a multi-story condo, you've got healthy reserves, you can keep that building structurally safe. You have the money to do the inspections, you have the money to do the repairs. Safety is a big thing there when you have people living on top of other people. Aligns and guides capital projects. So the reserve study gives you much more than just a dollar number on each project. It gives you the quantity, it gives you the timing. And so when you start to do the capital projects, you can look at that report, go to that section of that component, and you have all this information, that will help you when you go to get those bids. You already are very, more informed than someone who doesn't have a reserve study with that component in it. Also fulfills the board's fiduciary duty and supports regulatory compliance. Like this is another 2-hour course on regulations and restrictions in Florida when it comes to reserves. I mean, let's not even talk about CERS with 3-story condos and 718 and the waiving of reserves and component funding and restricted reserves. So it's another thing that we have to navigate. So it's something that we really have to take seriously. Board liability. So I'm not sharing this to scare anybody, but I think good boards deserve good information. And you, as a board, you do have a legal and ethical obligation to manage the association resources responsibly, make informed decisions, and avoid conflicts of interest. You can do all of that with a professional reserve study. We're managing the resources because we're optimizing the money that we're getting in our reserves. We're making informed decisions. Yeah, because we've got a reserve consultant guiding us and avoiding conflict of interest because we're relying on third-party objective information. The business judgment rule definitely applies. Decisions must be made in good faith, after reasonable inquiry, and in the best interest of the association. And recommendations should support the board's long-term strategy. If one doesn't align, document the rationale rather than ignore it. What I mean by that is like, don't just like hire someone to do your reserve study and then like not have a conversation with them, not tell them what you're trying to accomplish as a board, what you've been through, where you're trying to take the association, and then get a reserve study that like is a map to a place you don't want to go, basically. If it is, change that because they should align. And of course, like we have to find that common ground. We have to meet in the middle. If you guys are, desirous of something that goes against our professional recommendations, say, we have to push back. And that's why you hire a professional. But there's a lot of gray area in a reserve study where the board can say, you know what, this is really important to us. Or this is how we've been doing it and it's working really well. And we keep doing it this way. That's really important too. Consequences of falling short, we talked about the cost of inaction. Things get ugly quick. And when you get a good reserve plan in place, like you can get to almost like autopilot. You establish this culture at your association. We get regular updates to the reserve study. We've always contributed to our reserves. Every owner knows that we're keeping up with inflation on our reserves, but in the big picture, we've got a plan for everything. It's almost like autopilot, which is great because you got 100 other things you need to deal with. So why don't we at least get rid of one unknown, get rid of some of the headaches when it comes to our long-term planning, because that tool is available. So keeping the reserve study current, it's a best practice to update the study with a site visit, which if you were paying attention, that's a level 2, every 3rd year. So that's like CAI's guidance for associations. But annually, you really should be looking at this as costs change, the actual implementation of your plan is going to change. So you can do like a financial update annually. That's probably a good practice. There's a handout on the table here, and I can share it digitally, called the Rhythm of Readiness, which is like the reserve study life cycle. And you don't really see this clearly laid out, but the plan here is like we get the full reserve study level 1. Call that year one. Year 2 and 3, we do a level 3. We do the financial update annually, make sure everything is still calibrated and following, aligning with reality. And then year 3, we do a level 2 with the site visit. And then the next 2 years, we do 2 more financial updates and another site visit the third year, rinse and repeat. So that's kind of the rhythm of readiness. Also cost effective because you're not doing a full reserve study every time. One thing that I see a lot is like associations will be like, hey, I need to get a reserve study done. Can you give me a quote? And they don't know what they're even asking for. So, I guess we'll just bid like a full level 1 reserve study. It's like, oh, well, we had a reserve study done 2 years ago. Like, well, all right, then let's talk updates. Let's save you some money. Let's see if there's some quantities in there or some components in there that we can use. There's got to be something we can use to bring our level 1 price down. So that's going to be in your best interest to understand those different levels of service and really what you need. And if you don't know, ask the provider. Say, look, we just want to have an updated reserve study. We did it this year. We used this firm. What does it look like to get things up to date? And they'll tell you what your options are. So keeping the reserve study current, a moment in time. So the reserve study captures one specific moment in time. It's a very intelligent projection. It's evidence-based. Remember, we had boots on the ground. We measured everything. It's as good as you can get with a projection, but it's a projection. And that's why we want to keep things updated. And regular updates capture changes to the conditions, inflation, project timing, also the actual funding. So when we put together this strategic funding plan, we lay out like, all right, well, put 20,000 in reserves this year and then bump it up to 22.5 and then 23.7 in the following year. And then what happens is you have to follow that because it's inputs and outputs. And when we put together this strategic plan, like the final balance in the first year is our starting balance in the next year. And so everything is kind of building on each other. It's assuming that we're doing everything that the study says, both on the collecting the reserve funds on the funding side, but also on the expense side. So there's an assumption that the expenses are coming in at that time, at that amount. And we all know that nobody has a crystal ball. So those things do change. So I would caution you that if you have a 5-year-old reserve study that no one's looked at for 5 years and you dig it up out of someone's drawer, don't just look at go to 2027 and find out what the funding recommendation was and think that you're going to be in a solid position. Because that number is only good if everything else was true, everything else is still accurate. That's why it's so important to keep these studies updated so that we're building future information on a foundation of accurate, good information. Just some things that can change over time, which we really talked about, but also communities can change. You can, take, once was the tennis court, now it's a basketball court, or, we rebuilt this, redid this, added this. We want to capture those things in reserve study updates too. And yet, just to reiterate, national reserve study standards, best practice for a site inspection-based reserve study update is at least every 3rd year. So when we're talking about using the report, using the tool, you can use it for regulatory needs, make sure you're meeting state laws, local regulations. For bids, you have a great project scope starting place under each component, realistic cost expectations. For funding, it supports planning for special assessments or financing options like loans. And then for budgeting, you get direction on setting your annual reserve contributions and managing those projects effectively. All right, are we on time? Oh, we're great, okay. So, if I had to leave you guys with only 6 things after doing this for 15 years, this would be them. I call it tricks of the trade. The first one, we already kind of talked about, but this is very important. Quality in, quality out. Basically, the accuracy of the reserve study is directly tied to the quality of the information you provide. Incomplete, outdated component lists, missing quantities, unclear ownership responsibilities they're going to lead to flawed financial planning. So as a board, you can take it upon yourself to make sure we're giving our reserve provider great information, everything that they need. So make sure your study starts with verified, accurate data, from clear ownership definitions to appropriate component thresholds, which we also talked about. Make sure that we don't take that one-size-fits-all approach. I need to know that repair is coming up because I have a small association. I get, for that 1,000-home HOA, they don't care. That's a rounding error for them. But for us, we're going to feel that, and I need that in my reserve schedule. If the inputs are right, the outcomes will serve you well. Understand the why behind the numbers. That's my second tip, is that the reserve study isn't just a report, but it's a roadmap. But if you don't understand how the numbers were built, you can't use them to your advantage. So that's something that I really think is important. I personally invested in is not just telling folks what, but explaining why, because that's going to empower you to make better decisions, to lead your residents better. So work with someone who will explain not just what your funding plan recommends, but why. You should leave your study presentation understanding your plan as well as your provider does. And also, you guys know your association way better than we do. We're only out there for a day usually for the meeting, for the inspection. You're there all the time. You live there. You know these people. You know that property. So it's great to, share that information with us to make sure that if you know the why and you have all of this great real world information, that's a powerful combination to get a very accurate, very useful tool. Which kind of foreshadows collaboration is everything. Reserve planning is a team sport. Best results happen when managers, boards, and reserve analysts work together. Your reserve study should reflect your unique situation, not a one-size-fits-all template. So if you contract with a reserve study firm and then they send you a reserve study report and you didn't even know they were on site, that's a problem because you're not collaborating. You're not getting that meeting of the minds, that's everything. Like I said, that meeting, that's like getting our ducks in a row. When you think about it, if we're using that same analogy, if the meeting is like our medical history, when we go over that with the doctor, maybe we tell them we're deathly allergic to some medication. And because we didn't have that conversation, that's what he's going to prescribe. It's very important that we build this tool on a collaborative effort. And not all reserve studies are created equal. So yes, there are national reserve study standards, but everybody takes different approaches. Everybody does things differently. So, just lower fees often, not always, but often mean corners cut, whether that's site time, report customization, and that can cost you down the road. So look beyond price, ask providers how they structure their studies. You've got to be able to use things. You got to be able to understand it and read it and help others do that too. What assumptions they're going to make and how they handle tricky gray area items. That's one where we need to have intelligent conversations where I can say, you know what? Let me tell you about this operating threshold thing because this is something we really want to get right. So let's figure this out together. Experience counts. So we talked about it's a projection, it's a forecast. And forecasting really though is part science and part judgment. And good judgment comes from experience. So work with a firm that's seen just about everything. Phase development, aging infrastructure, litigation scenarios, sudden disasters, because experience means better, more realistic plans that hold up in the real world. That's a good word right there. Because a reserve study is a forecast, it's a prediction, but with experience, you get better at that. And you've seen things and you know things, and so you can come up with a better plan. And use it, don't shelf it. Your reserve study isn't a regulatory checkbox. It's a living financial planning tool. So update it, reference it in annual budgets, use it for vendor bids, special assessments, loan applications. A study you actively use is worth its weight in gold. And it really is. I mean, if you're talking business, the ROI on a great reserve study that you're actually using could be massive. Because we're talking about big ticket capital projects. And if we're doing things right, we can do them at the right time. We can do them for the right price. We're funding our reserves strategically, we're optimizing our reserve funds, and like the savings start to compound real quick. And also not just the financial savings, like the headache of the distrust of not planning, of our community not thinking that we have a plan in place, special assessments, the legal fees, the this, the that, like a reserve study that you actively use is worth its weight in gold. So we started today, and I said, you know, every great building begins with a foundation, and communities are no different. Reserve studies don't eliminate surprises, but they help prepare us for them, and they don't guarantee perfect decisions, unfortunately, but they help boards make more informed ones. So reserve planning isn't about predicting the future, but it's about preparing for it. Not reports, not spreadsheets, not component lists. Helping communities, helping boards make better decisions so that they can become better communities. That's what it's about. So with that, I'm happy to take questions, hang around. I'm not in a rush to get out of here. So thank you guys for everything, but that's all of the material that I have planned today.
Thank you. Nick, we have like 5 or 6 questions online.
Oh, okay. Let's take a look.
Go to the Q&A.
Yeah. Look at, they're still with us. Good. Thank you guys for hanging around.
I've been answering some things, but
Okay. Shall I look at the open ones?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Ruth's comment was, the reserve study we pay for has numerous inconsistencies, errors, and addition errors for total reserve costs. We cannot get the company to correct their oversights. Who at DBPR is our advocate for correcting? Ruth. That's tough, because DBPR, they're not reserve study experts. You know, they can make sure that you're complying in the fact that you have a reserve study, but who is advocating for correcting? I'm here for you. Seriously, like send me the study. I mean, that's part of that. Not all reserve studies are created equal. Everyone makes mistakes. That I can get. That's forgivable. That's human. But, you know, to not be willing to have the conversation and get you guys the solution you need, I think you just might have to find another partner, and feel free to, you know, reach out to me. I'd be happy to have a conversation and be your advocate for correcting. When I agreed to be on the board, they said we are insured against liability. How do I know if that's true? You'd have to ask, you know, find out about their insurance policies. Typically, they have like directors and officers insurance, which does protect board members against a lot of liability. But if you're not acting in good business judgment, then you're kind of outside of that, and you can be held personally liable, to my understanding. But in your specific situation, you'd want to check with your insurance agent and see what type of policies and coverage that you have for, notably, that directors and officers insurance, and then make sure that you're using good business judgment, the good business judgment rules. Please discuss pooled reserve funds versus line item, and can one be changed to the other? Tom?
Can you read those questions a little more clearly? It's a little bit more difficult to hear you in here.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. So the last question was, when I agreed to be on the board, they said we are insured against liability. How do I know that that's true? Likely, you know, we're talking about like personal liability, as we did mention, like the good business judgment rule. Yeah, if you're making decisions outside of that, then boards can be held personally liable. So that's why it's good to rely on professionals and follow their advice. Tom asked to discuss pooled reserve funds versus line item, and can one be changed? Can it be changed from one to the other? Tom, I got an hour course on that, but really what I described today, remember I talked about the balance of saving our reserves and spending our reserves and looking at all the components at once and then optimizing our contributions to reserves? That's basically pooled funding, because when we're looking at the collective of all of our components and then funding against the whole collective with a cash flow analysis, that's pooled funding because we have a pool of assets. The line item is when we determine the funding amount by each individual component based on just straight line depreciation. So whatever portion of the component's useful life has been used up, assuming we should have that proportionate amount of reserve funds collected for that component. And we do that individually. So let's say, we're halfway through the life of our roof, then we should have half the money. And next year it's going to be, if it's a 30-year thing, then we should have 1/30th more the following year, so on and so forth, that by the year of its useful life ending, we have the full funds available. And then when you come up with like the full amount, you add all of those up at the very end. So we have our roof contribution, we have our roads contribution, we have this contribution, which we've individually calculated, and then we add them up at the end. And that's why when I'm talking about these pooled reserve plans, I keep using the word optimized, because it's a much more strategic and optimized approach, because you can cover the same projects, but have lower reserve balances and lower required reserve contributions, because you're looking at everything at once. Then if you individually do them and then, at the very end, we got to add them all up in it. But no, when we're looking at everything all together, then we can be more strategic about how much we really need from a cash flow perspective. Can you change from one to the other? Yes, you can. There's a lot of nuance to that, depending on if you're governed by 718 or 720, what your documents say, how those funds were set up. Happy to look at the specifics with you anytime. Dominic was having some trouble signing in, so okay. Our HOA has had 3 full reserve studies and 2 follow-ups in the past 8 years. Every one of them ended in the same place as the carton in the last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Our board is of the mode of reserve study. We ain't got no reserve study. We don't got to show you any reserve study. Oh, okay. You're not alone. A lot of boards either just don't understand the value of reserve studies, or maybe they've been burned. They haven't seen good ones. So their example or their, their experience with reserve studies has not been a very helpful, promising one, you don't see that as a worthwhile investment. But hopefully everything that I shared today kind of helped illustrate that, if you get a good reserve study, like I was saying, it really is worth its weight in gold. And we don't have a reserve study. We don't have to show you a reserve study. That's going to be harder and harder to stand by, now and moving forward with, what's happening with condos and SERS, all of the Fannie Mae regulation and guidelines. The majority of loans in Fannie Mae before August 2nd, this happened just days ago, this is very current. They went through August 3rd. They went through what's called a limited review process. And if it went through the limited review process, they never looked at the association's financials. Okay? They have retired the limited review process, which means every single loan now, they're going to open the financials. They're going to look at, potentially if you don't meet the funding benchmark, they're going to look at your reserve study. So the idea of not having a reserve study present is not just going to, now it might just make you a little bit different or unique, but it's going to make it hard to do business as an association. And it's going to lock out your association from a market of buyers. It's going to affect your marketability. It's going to affect the value of your units. It's going to have real implications. And that's just going to, that trend is really just continuing. So I just had a lender this week tell me that they asked for the SERS at a condo before they approved the loan. I mean, it's going to be hard to have a healthy association and not be able to present healthy finances, healthy financials, and a current reserve study. We're getting to that place, or at least that you're funding to their benchmark. So if you don't have a reserve study and you're putting a ton of money into reserve, doesn't sound like you're probably not optimizing. You probably overfunding, but it's better than not having anything in reserve. When considering a level 2 study, which is a reserve study update with a site visit, is it best to return to the originator of the level 1 or contract a fresh set of eyes? How does one find reputable agents to complete the study? That's Frank's question. Frank, that's a great question. And fresh set of eyes I hear that all the time. People put a lot of value in that. And I guess if you feel like there's, room for improvement in your reserve study, then yeah, maybe a fresh set of eyes would be good. There's also benefits that if you have a partner that you really like, sticking with them, because they're going to probably give you a more competitive cost because they're familiar with your community. and you already know you like them. Every provider does things different. Every report is different. So if you start going to a different provider, then you need to learn to read that report. It's almost like having to learn a new language a little bit. So it can go either way. Cost wise, generally speaking, you'd probably be able to save some money sticking with the same provider, but you'd be surprised. I've gotten asked to provide proposals, and we're a new proposal. The other firm is updating it, and they're much higher than we would be for a new study. So costing, at the end of the day, pick the partner that's right for you. If you're happy with them and you're getting what you need, and the study is something that you can use, that's probably the first person I would go to get it updated. Donald asked, what is the typical cost for a reserve study for a small HOA community? I think like the smallest are probably around like $3,000. It seems to be like the floor. Because you think even if you have just a couple of components to look at, that engineer still has to come on site. They're still meeting with you. They're still reviewing the information. They're still writing a report, reviewing a report. So there kind of is this floor, but they go up from there. Every association is unique, so every reserve study proposal is unique. But feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to get you a firm cost. Just need a little bit more information about your community. George says, how do I get our accountants and auditors to consider the estimated remaining useful life, along with the original replacement cost of assets in our reserve study, to accurately report depreciation and amortization? They seem to want to follow their rules rather than the reality of aging. George, that's kind of a tough one because CPAs are held to different standards than reserve study providers, and there isn't always perfect alignment in that. But if there's something that you feel strongly about or that your reserve study reflects that's different than what you're getting from your auditors or your accountants, it's a good conversation to have. They're not reserve study experts by any means, but they have to follow their rules because that's their professional designation. They don't have to follow, reserve specialist rules or a professional reserve analyst rules. And that's kind of just the situation there. Things are going to be a little bit different between the two. Talk about line item reserves. Can you move funds without a vote? That's tough to answer like a blanket statement because it depends on so many things. Like I said, how the funds were established, what type of association you have, what the accounts currently look like, those types of things.
They can call their management company and they should be able to answer that.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can call your management company and they should be able to answer those.
And if you don't have a management company, you can call us.
But that's a good, the fact that you're even asking that question is good because you realize that there is some restriction there. If you do have your reserves that are restricted, it's good to know like, hey, I can't just use a roof reserve on something else if I have restricted reserves. And I can't just automatically start pooling reserves. In most cases, but now boards, there's a thing that boards can pool their reserves with SIRS without a member vote because it's, more appealing, less. That's kind of a nuanced thing. That's like another class. But reality is line item reserves, can you move funds without a vote? Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And I hate to give that answer, but that's the reality in that one. Good preventative maintenance extends the useful life of equipment and facilities. The inverse is a major problem that reserve studies does not consistently take that into account. How can we at the community level help correct this problem? That's a great question too. And I talked about that. In an ideal scenario, when we're determining remaining useful life, we're looking at maintenance, the history of maintenance, and what's been done and how those components have been maintained. What can you do as a community to help correct that problem? I would say just, provide that information to your reserve specialist. Give them the history of maintenance, give them that maintenance schedule, what you guys have been doing. Tell them that this is a priority and it's something that you want to make sure is reflected. And I get that because if you're spending a lot of money maintaining the component, you're not doing that just to do it. You're doing that so you get more life out of it. And then ultimately that should help in the long run when you're looking at replacement timing. And so if you're investing this money in the maintenance, but then you're getting just a standard replacement timing that doesn't reflect what you're doing, I can see why you'd ask this question and why that would be challenging. Bring that up with your reserve provider. That's a great conversation to have. but keep good records and make sure that you put that in front of them. One thing we have is making sure new boards understand the importance of staying on track once reserves go pooled. It should be heavily stressed to boards as consequence is overspending. That's Jonathan's question. Yeah, so that's a very common like fear or concern with pooling the reserves is, well, if we put everything together, then we can just spend it however we want. And the reality is, like, if someone's really going to do something unscrupulous or shady, like with the reserve funds, they're going to do that if you have straight line reserves too. And also, pooled reserves, there still is like the itemized expenses. So you can't just spend your pooled reserves on anything you want. It has to be spent on something that's in the pool. And so there are still protections and, you know, almost like levels of restrictions even in pooled reserves. It's not just like a free for all where we just have a dollar amount and we just spend it on whatever we want. There is much more clarity on what those funds are designed to be used for. And I think that more often than not, the benefit of the lower reserve balance that you need to carry, the benefit of the lower contribution requirements will far outweigh any concern of like financial mismanagement now that we're switching to pooled. Because really, if someone wants to do something and they're in a position to do it, they can do it whether you're pooled or component. So that's that one. Debbie says we have a fire pump that needs to be replaced now. The reserve study was done 2 years ago and the fire pump needs to be replaced now. But the replacement year on that is 2052. If we go ahead and pull that funding out now in full, Debbie, that's a great opportunity to, you know, that sounds like a financial update. They probably don't need to come back on site to look at it. If you know it needs to be replaced, it's already in the study, but just at the wrong time. But you probably want to get everything updated if you're going to move that forward before you spend it would be ideal, so that the funding plan can be adjusted for having more of a near-term expense that wasn't accounted for. There's also things you can look at that might be able to buy you some time depending on the specifics of your funding plan. So if you got a nice healthy balance and you can clearly see that you don't have major projects that are going to need those funds in the next year, 2 years, and that if you had a little bit lower, you'd still have a nice threshold, then maybe you can absorb that and wait. But I would talk to your reserve provider and let them make that call so that you're still following an accurate plan. But yeah, I mean, you got to replace it when it needs to be replaced. You can't wait. That thing has to be done. But definitely, you know, incorporate it into the reserve study as soon as you can. What's the suggestion in conducting a reserve study when multiple associations are within the community? That can be tricky. Multiple associations, sometimes that means multiple boards, often it does. Boards have different decision-making authorities, they have different processes, different timelines. If all of the boards kind of work together and they're physically located in the same location, then it can be, you know, cost effective to kind of do like a group thing, like, hey, we'll all do them together, we'll all approve them together. I will say that I've seen this work cause more trouble than like benefit in my experience, because we're talking about different like individual entities that have different views, different processes. And if one's not online with the program, then it kind of throws everything off. But if there's like some shared decision, or there's like an umbrella association that can help manage things and move the pieces together and align all of that, then you can have a nice economy of scale. Say, hey, well, we're coming out there anyway, so we can, you know, give you this % discount on all the studies if you authorize them all together. It's also nice to get into the same timing. So if you do them as a group, then you kind of get into the same update timing and everybody is staying on track. And it's kind of can keep everybody accountable too. All the different associations are in it together. How important is determining what should and shouldn't be included in reserves? Warren asks. That's everything. Because like I said, if you put the wrong address in your ways, you're not going to the right place. If it's like, that's the very basic, is we've got to get the component list right. I talked about the double funding or leaving things out. That can be really troublesome because every component in our reserve study that is a reserve component, we're considering that expense in our reserve funding calculation. So if it's in there, we're going to ask our residents for money, and that's going to be part of that. So if it's not supposed to be in there, then we shouldn't be asking for money for that. Also, if it's not in there and we have to fund its replacement, then we're not going to have a funding source identified for that. So getting the right components is everything, Warren. That's foundational. Is there a training class that covers the mechanics of reserve funding in conjunction with the operating budget? There's a lot of great information on reserve funding. Actually, CAI has some great resources. They have like a reserve, workshop and things like that. If you go to caionline.org, they're kind of the ones that set the standard for the definitions, and all the professionals in our industry look to them. But we also have some other courses as well. So if you want to reach out to me, I can tell you about those opportunities too. Personal response to Q&A from Ruth. Thank you so much for reaching out. The previous board paid a lot for Milestone Traditional and SIRS study. You're not alone. Those are expensive studies, and they were, when they were new and everybody needed them, they were even more expensive. We live in a large master association which handles roads, stormwater, etc. They're divided into 114 smaller associations. Single floor ranch duplex like is the reserve just on common area where a 28 unit or 14 buildings, no other common building but post office stops, is grass in reserves. Oh, Marcia, there's a lot there. Let's talk further one-on-one about that. Real quick, is grass in reserves can be, the definition of reserve component is that it has a predictable remaining useful life. Landscaping is tough because you can't really predict when it's going to live, how long it's going to live. But if the landscaping or the grass or the green areas or the preserve, if they're large enough to have a meaningful required like maintenance or project, then yeah, we can put the landscaping in the reserve study. It's handled typically as like an allowance. So perfect example is like we've been spending $5,000 every 3 years to dig up these dead palms and replant these other ones. Like if you're going to keep doing that and it's at a high enough cost, yeah, let's build that into the reserve study. So landscaping can be incorporated. It's generally not by default. That's a case by case basis. How are we on time, Brenda? You got a couple more questions?
Take 2 more minutes.
Okay. Perfect.
In person.
Joseph asked, what factors determine the cost of the reserve study? Is there an average cost? Average cost is probably $3,500. Smaller associations can be less, bigger, easily more. What determines the cost? The biggest thing is the number of components and the complexity of those components. Age is also a factor because when we're looking at the list of the reserve components, older buildings, older communities have more that need to be done. So you get more projects, more components that fall into that 30-year window. A brand new community, things don't happen in 30 years to some of these, longer lived components. The other thing is the complexity of your financial setup. So if you've got a tiered budget with 5 different cost centers, you've got townhomes and live to work, and you've got a master association, financial complexity will add to the cost of the study as well. So not just physically what's on site, but also look at the financial complexity. Case by case basis, happy to get you a quote, reach out. And do reserve study, last question we're going to take from our online folks, which thank you for all the questions. Thank you for interacting. Scott asked, do reserve studies and SIRS studies overlap? Yeah, they do and they can, and that's an important thing to understand. Because the SIRS study, for those that aren't familiar, that's a structural integrity reserve study. That's a statutorily required reserve study on a handful of specific structural components. There's like 8 or 9 components, and to comply as a SIRS, you only need to look at these 8 or 9 components. But one of them is like the building envelope, which includes the roof. As you saw, like a regular reserve study, we definitely look at your roof because that's if the association owns it, that's a component that we would have in there. So there's that overlap. Is yeah, if you get a full reserve study on a building and a SIRS only on a building, you're going to have roofs in one study, roofs in another study. So yeah, there is an overlap. What you want to do is have your SIRS and your reserve study for the non-structural components like done holistically, where you get one firm that's going to look at our non-structural components, they're going to look at our SIRS components and give us the full funding picture. Tell us what we need in our structural account, tell us what we need in the non-structural. Then you don't have to worry about that overlap. If you start piecemealing things, firm A does your SIRS, it has roofs, you get a full reserve study from firm B, you got roofs and roofs. Now things are starting to get real messy. So I've had to navigate with these kind of overlapping, the new requirements overlapping with what associates have been doing historically. But that's typically what I would recommend is like do it holistically, do it together so you have the full funding picture. Any questions in the room?
Audience.
I had some questions about, and this is involved both the Sears reserve. We have a Sears and a non-Sears reserve, but where you're replacing, for instance, our fire pump, we had to replace a coupling between the diesel engine and the pump. Had to replace some starters on it. Then with our garage doors, we have 12 individual garage doors, 2 large common garage doors. So we had to replace like some small garage door openers. Then we get into a discussion on the board. Well, that's part of that component should come out of the reserves. Some of the others, myself included, feel it should come out of our maintenance budget. So is there a rule of thumb, particularly like in our fire pump, we've got, that's a reserved item. We've got a life on that. We are meticulous about maintaining it, which means you're going to have repairs along the way.
Like the starter.
But
Right.
I don't want to deplete the reserves because when we repair it, all of those pieces we put on it will probably be obsolete and won't go on the new engine. So.
So for the online folks, the question was basically about doing like repairs to a component before you do a complete replacement. And even if that component is in your reserve study or your SIRS, would a repair to a portion of that component would it be appropriate to use the reserves for that, or would you handle that from a different funding source? How would you go about deciding what's right? This happens quite a bit because the reserve study is going to have some detail about what's included in that cost, but not every detail. And what I see happen is that the board will reach out to the reserve study provider and ask that question, because a lot of times we can go back to our notes on our worksheets and how the engineer worked up that cost. Did it include that project? Did it include that, partial component or whatever? Another example is like for like a paint cost, we'll get a call and be like, well, does that include painting the soffit or the fascia, or is it just the building itself? And so breaking down the cost into like more things like incremental, smaller pieces. A lot of times the reserve provider can provide insight into when they gave you that cost, was that already accounted for in there? And you should use the reserves, or if it's not, then it would be outside of that. But it's a great like real world example of kind of like that gray area too. And even the reserve provider won't be able to account for everything. So at some point, good business judgment comes in and you make a call. But then you realize like the impact of what funding source you use later on when you do the other replacement, keeping good records and keeping track of all of that to make sure that everybody's clear on what's happened with that component when you do, update the study. But ask the reserve provider, when they built out that cost, did it include the starter or just the complete replacement of this component?
And then I got one more question too, and I think I already know the answer to this, but you're the expert. So, for instance, we had under our Sears study, our building was scheduled to be painted last year or during 2025, which was a significant cost. We brought out an expert to take a look at the building. He said this paint is really good. The reserve study only gave it a 7-year life. We put a 10-year system on this, and it's still in good shape. So he recommended we keep it, and of course we follow that recommendation. There's no use in replacing a component that doesn't need replacing. So then I would assume in that circumstance, we just need to update our reserve model. Would that be right?
You would, yeah. I think following like the professional recommendation on how it looks and when it needs to be replaced, it's smart. But the DBPR would look at it, they just want to know if you're following the funding recommendation of the SERS and following the SERS plan. So if you're going to move that up, which it sounds like, might be the right move, you'd want to update the study so that it reflects that, so that everything is still compliant. Okay. Any other questions in the room? And I'll be hanging around too, once we hang up the phone. Okay.
All good?
All right.
Well, thank you everyone online for participating today.